Right now, somewhere above the Atlantic, 400 people are asleep in pressurized aluminium tubes moving at 570 miles per hour, 35,000 feet above the ocean. They will land safely. They will collect their bags. They will never once think about the man who made that possible, a working-class boy from Coventry who figured out, at the age of 22, how to move human beings through the sky faster than sound could carry a warning. He died watching other people count the money. His name was Frank Whittle, and the engine in every commercial aircraft you have ever boarded, the engine that shrank the planet, that turned a week-long ocean crossing into a 7-hour inconvenience, that made the modern world navigable, came entirely from his mind. The British government paid him £10,000 for it. Then they handed it to private companies who built billion-pound empires on the back of his drawings. This is that story. Frank Whittle was born in 1907 in Earlston, a working-class suburb of Coventry. His father was a mechanic who ran a small tool-making business from a rented house, the kind of man who understood how machines worked and passed that obsession down like a genetic trait. The family was not poor in the desperate sense, but they were close enough to the edge that Frank grew up understanding, viscerally, that the distance between where he was and where he wanted to be was enormous and would not close on its own. He was small, that is not a trivial detail. When he first applied to join the Royal Air Force as an officer cadet in 1923, they turned him down twice on physical grounds. He was 5 feet tall and his chest measurement didn't meet the minimum. He spent 6 months doing exercises to expand his chest. He grew 2 inches. He applied again. They let him in. That pattern, rejection, obstruction, quiet, ferocious persistence, became the defining rhythm of his life. He trained as a pilot and was exceptional at it. His instructors noted something unusual. He didn't just fly aircraft, he interrogated them. He wanted to understand exactly why they behaved the way they did, what their limits were, and why those limits existed. By the time he reached Cranwell to train as an officer, he was writing theoretical essays that his instructors could barely follow. In 1928, as a final-year cadet, he wrote a thesis titled Future Developments in Aircraft Design. In it, he argued that aircraft would need to fly far higher and far faster than the piston engine could take them, and that the way to achieve this was through a new kind of engine entirely, one that compressed air, mixed it with fuel, ignited the mixture, and expelled the exhaust in a continuous thrust, not the intermittent firing of pistons driving a propeller. A single, smooth, continuous burn. He called it a turbine-based jet engine. His thesis received high marks. His instructors praised it. Nobody at the Air Ministry read it. In 1929, he brought the idea to the Air Ministry directly, proposing that the RAF should investigate his engine concept as a serious engineering project. The response was a formal assessment that concluded the concept was impractical and that the metallurgical challenges alone, the heat tolerances required of the turbine blades, made the whole proposal unfeasible. The official who signed off on that assessment was not a stupid man. But he was a man embedded in an institution that had never been forced to reckon with something genuinely new. Whittle applied for a patent in January 1930. He paid the filing fees himself. The patent was granted. The Air Ministry declined to renew it in 1935, deciding not to pay the modest maintenance fees, and the patent lapsed into the public domain. Just like that, the government put the foundational document of the jet age into the hands of anyone who wanted it, because they didn't believe it would amount to anything. Here is the part that is worth sitting with. The German engineer Hans von Ohain, who developed the first jet engine to actually fly, powering the Heinkel He-178 in August 1939, has acknowledged in his own writing that he was unaware of Whittle's work when he began his research in 1935. The parallel development is genuine, but Whittle was first. His patent came 5 years earlier. And while von Ohain worked with the full backing of the German aviation industry, Whittle spent those same years begging. In 1935, with his patent expired and no government support forthcoming, Whittle was approached by 2 former RAF officers, Rolf Dudley Williams and J.C.B. Tinling, who had read his work and believed in it. Together, they found private investors, a small banking group, and formed a company called Power Jets Limited. Whittle owned a share. The RAF, acknowledging that he was now technically working on something that might have military relevance, allowed him to participate while keeping him on officer's pay. That pay was modest. The investment capital power Jets raised was modest. Everything about this enterprise was precarious. Whittle built his first experimental engine in a small leased workshop. He supervised the machining of components at outside firms because power jets couldn't afford to make them in-house. He worked with materials that were at the edge of what 1930s metallurgy could produce, designing around limitations in real time. When the first test run of the engine took place in April 1937, the turbine spun up and then refused to stop. The fuel system was feeding uncontrolled, and the engine was accelerating beyond its rated speed, while everyone in the room ran for the exits. Whittle stayed at the controls and shut it down manually. He was living on RAF pay, running a revolutionary engineering program with private money, and nearly dying in the process. The British government, at this point, was watching with what might charitably be called cautious interest and less charitably called indifference. The Ministry of Aircraft Production began to take power jets slightly more seriously after 1939, when war made the question of air superiority suddenly urgent. They provided some funding, but the arrangement they structured was deliberately limiting. Power jets would be the research entity, the ideas factory. The actual manufacturing of engines for production aircraft would be contracted to established industrial firms, Rover Company initially, and then Rolls-Royce. This was presented as practical. Britain needed industrial capacity, not a small workshop. That is a fair argument. What happened next is not. Rover, which held the manufacturing contract, began modifying Whittle's engine designs without consulting him. Engineers at Rover made changes they believed were improvements. Some were, some degraded performance. Whittle spent months in a state of technical fury, fighting to maintain the integrity of his own design while having no formal authority over the company that was building it. The working relationship collapsed. In 1942, in an extraordinary moment of informal deal-making, Rolls-Royce's Ernest Hives met Rover's Spencer Wilkes at a roadside hotel and traded the jet engine contract for a Rolls-Royce tank engine factory. Whittle was not at the table. He was not consulted. His engine was bartered like a commodity by two men who had not invented it. Rolls-Royce was, by any measure, an exceptional engineering firm. They improved the Whittle engine. They made it manufacturable at scale. The Gloucester Meteor, powered by Whittle's jet, entered RAF service in 1944 and was the only Allied jet aircraft to see operational service in the Second World War. It intercepted V-1 flying bombs over southern England, tilting its wing against theirs to topple them before they reached London. The engine worked. The engine had always worked. By the time the war ended, Whittle had been running on something close to fumes, medically, personally, psychologically. In 1944, he suffered what was described at the time as a nervous breakdown. He had been working for years under conditions that would have broken most people before they started: institutional contempt, financial anxiety, loss of control over his own invention, the constant friction of an RAF career running alongside an engineering project that neither the RAF nor the government fully claimed as their own. He was smoking heavily, sleeping badly, and was described by people who knew him as a man running on will alone. In 1944, the government nationalized Power Jets. The small company that Whittle and his partners had built was absorbed into a state research establishment. The private investors received compensation. The engineers received their salaries. The government now owned the research operation outright. And in 1948, the Royal Commission on Awards to Inventors made its final assessment of what Frank Whittle was owed for the jet engine. They reviewed the evidence. They acknowledged his contribution. They awarded him a one-time, ex gratia payment of £100,000, later reduced in some accounts, but the figure most cited in official records is that amount before tax, representing the government's total reckoning of his claim. What that number actually meant depended on what you compared it to. Rolls-Royce, by the 1950s, was building a global business on jet engine production. De Havilland, which licensed the technology, powered the world's first commercial jet airliner, the Comet, which entered service in 1952. The post-war commercial aviation industry, worth hundreds of billions of pounds across the second half of the 20th century, rested on the thermodynamic principles that a working-class RAF officer had worked out in a Cranwell thesis and patented at his own expense. Whittle received a knighthood in 1948. He resigned his RAF commission the same year, citing his health. He was 41 years old. He emigrated to the United States in the 1970s and took a position at the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis as a research professor, where he was received with the kind of genuine institutional enthusiasm that had eluded him entirely in Britain. He married again, happily, by most accounts. He watched the aviation industry he had created generate wealth on a scale that is almost impossible to frame accurately. He gave interviews. He wrote a memoir called Jet. He was precise, measured, and careful not to sound bitter in public, which is perhaps its own kind of quiet statement about the kind of man he was. He died in Columbia, Maryland, in 1996, at the age of 89. In the year he died, the global commercial aviation industry carried 1.3 billion passengers. Every one of them flew on a version of the engine that the British government once declined to pay £14 to maintain in patent. What do you do with a story like this? The easy reading is corruption, powerful men stealing from a powerless one. But the reality is more damaging than that, because it doesn't require villains. It requires a system. The Air Ministry officials who dismissed Whittle's 1929 proposal were not corrupt. They were embedded in an institutional logic that allocated resources cautiously and distrusted the claims of junior officers who didn't have the right pedigree. The men at Rover who modified his designs without asking were not malicious. They were engineers who believed they knew better. The Royal Commission that awarded him his payment was not trying to insult him. They were applying a framework for compensation that had not been designed to grapple with something transformative. The class dimension is not incidental. It runs through every stage of this story like a load-bearing wall. Whittle had to expand his chest to get into the RAF. He had to find private investors because the establishment wouldn't back him. He had no network of well-connected friends who could open the right doors. What he had was an idea of extraordinary precision and a refusal to let it die. In any individual encounter, the system might have looked fair. Across his whole life, the system extracted everything he had and returned a fraction. There is a particular kind of institutional cruelty in the knighthood. It says, "We acknowledge that you did something remarkable." It does not say, "We will share with you what that remarkable thing produced." The honor and the money were carefully separated, as though the two had nothing to do with each other. Rolls-Royce today is one of the most valuable engineering brands in the world. The jet engines power aircraft on every continent. The company's annual revenue runs into the billions of pounds. They are, by any measure, an exceptional manufacturer, and they have earned what they have built in the decades since the war. That is also true. Both things are true simultaneously, and that is precisely what makes Whittle's story so difficult to dismiss. The next time you board a flight, the idle 30 seconds while you find your seat and stuff your bag into the overhead locker and wait. The engine outside your window is running on principles that a 22-year-old from Coventry wrote down in a notebook, while everyone around him explained, patiently and professionally, why it couldn't be done. He proved them wrong. He spent the rest of his life paying for the audacity of being right. Some stories end with justice delayed. This one doesn't. It ends with a man in Maryland watching planes pass overhead, carrying his invention and someone else's name. What you choose to do with that knowledge, whose side you're on when the next Frank Whittle walks into the room, is entirely up to you.